Happy week between Christmas and New Year. This is always such a fun, dead zone of the year. Very few people are going to work. I personally have off work, which I'm very excited about. You're not started on your new resolutions yet. You're kind of done with the big work of the holidays. And so it's a perfect time to get some reading done and some kind of relaxing. I am excited. It is Barnes & Noble's end of the year sale. So they have 25% off everything, I think, and I have a gift card. So I am going to hit the ground running with this reading vlog to try and see. I like to collect some titles for myself to get from the library, but I might also even splurge and just buy something if something catches my eye. So off we go. Before we go to Barnes & Noble, I have to head into Michael's. I have to get some supplies for my wedding save the dates. I've decided to do a lino cut print on them by hand, which is going to require a couple of materials that I don't yet have. I have to order fancy paper, which I'll be doing online, but Michael's has a handheld press. And then I also want to get another block of lino cut. If you haven't done lino cut carving before, it's basically like a big pink pearl eraser. It's like a big block of eraser-like material. But I have to get another one of those to try and do another pass at my design, see which one I like better, and then my mom and I will start hand pressing those in the coming weeks. Okay, not an unmitigated success. I ended up just getting the press, and then I went to buy the linoleum. And after just saying it's basically a giant pink eraser, I could not swallow my pride and pay $20 for it. So I think I'm happy with what I have, actually. I saw somebody talking about how Michael's has become 50% craft store and 50% crappy home decor or holiday decor store that nobody asked for. And that is so true. They're doing their Christmas turnover right now, and literally half the store is vacant and empty or 60% off. It's all on clearance basically the minute that it appears on shelves. And there's no crafting component. People who go into Michael's typically are looking to create something for themselves and realize an artistic vision. And all of these holiday decor items are what if you didn't do that and you just bought the cheap generic version? I don't know. It just seems kind of antithetical to what their client base is coming in for. And it doesn't seem like people are really buying this stuff because it's always on sale. And I just don't really understand the business model there. It kind of concerns me because after losing Joann's earlier this year, I don't know what I would do if there weren't Michael's around. And already there are so few craft stores that are easily available and have everything that's stocked. I was very lucky this store has a pretty good lino cut section, and it really is just one shelf. And so I don't know if it all gets taken over by home decor or if the home decor is a sign that not enough people are shopping there and they're kind of struggling. It makes me anxious. But either way, completed at Michael's, headed over to my happy place of Barnes & Noble, which fortunately does not seem to be branching out in weird directions in the same way. I could tell from the parking lot walking up that the store was bustling, and oh my god, was it ever. The fantasy section was basically ransacked, which was a bummer for me, but I always love seeing a bookstore doing well. Found a few next reads for my January TBR, but I didn't want to linger and film too long in case I was making anyone uncomfortable, so I just checked out with my one book and headed on home. I am back home and we are losing daylight fast, but I wanted to quickly go over my loot from my trip to Barnes & Noble, which is Bodacia's daughter. I feel like I'm in the 70s talking about somebody's jeans. This is by Elodie Harper. It's a historical fiction about the ancient Celtic warrior whose name is this. I've seen the name before. I've just never had to say it out loud. I've seen this book on shelves a few times, and The Wolf's Den by Elodie Harper was one of my 5-star historical fiction reads from last year. It was phenomenal. Elodie Harper handles historical fiction very well. She includes a ton of really vivid details. Her characters endure some historical challenges that are accurate and kind of heart-wrenching and brutal, but they are always really strong and capable and fun to pull for. So I'm excited to read this one, and I loved the cover and the foil on the cover. And because of the Barnes & Noble sale, this is typically 20 bucks. I think the last time I saw it was hardcover and it was more expensive. But I got it for 15 and I had a gift card. As excited as I am to read that book, it is not the primary book I'm planning to read for this video. That would be The Strength of the Few by James Islington. This is the second in his hierarchy duology. The first is The Will of the Many. It is a Roman-inspired epic fantasy series about kind of a conquering empire and one 19-year-old boy who is swept up in the conquest and is trying very hard to hold on to his own ideals and values and keep his own morals in sight as he is the lone survivor of his family to enter this new world and see how power is distributed there. This is the second installment. The world opens up enormously in this book, and I do not want to give any spoilers because I know that this is like a highly anticipated read, but I am that far through. I'm like 400 pages in of 700, and it has been knocking my socks off. And all I will say is if you heard Roman-inspired fantasy and you're like, oh, that's not my favorite era of the ancient world, which, shut up, that's a thing people do say and think. This installment pulls inspiration from not just the Roman Empire, but a couple of different ancient worlds in a really successful and interesting way. I am trying to read more epic fantasy, and this is making it very easy for me. So I'm excited to dive further into this book. But first, I'm going to eat some dinner, so I will be back in a little bit to read some more of this. Okay, it is officially well past my bedtime, but I have read another 70-ish pages of The Strength of the Few. I am now on page 500. And this book is just, on the one hand, it's reading slow. I got it almost a week ago now, over a week ago, and I'm still not finished with it. I tend to read like actual physical books a lot slower than ebooks and then audiobooks. But every time I sit down to read this, I end up finding time and pages just like disappearing. Viz, our main character, remains completely likable, and I just really want him to do well. He is being dealt like the world's worst hands. Each of the three storylines that we're following, I found initially that one in particular was like dragging a bit more. The other two had kind of an established set of stakes, and one of them, while it was personally actually my favorite because I like that era or that like landscape a lot more traditionally than the other landscapes, in terms of the politics, in terms of like what was going on, we were kind of building from complete scratch, as opposed to even one of the other storylines that was newly introduced is pulling on forces and connects more immediately to the initial storyline in the first book. And so it was easy to understand the stakes. The stakes were immediately super high, whereas in this third storyline, we're kind of like working our way up from zero, and we know a lot less about the rules and a lot less about the stakes. So that one was like a little bit slower and still very enjoyable to read. But now that one is picking up a lot too, and the storylines are starting to intersect in this last third of the book. I am just obsessed. I have talked about it way too long because it is past midnight and I am exhausted. But I just wanted to check in. This continues to be banger after banger. I really want to check out his other series now, which never would have appealed to me before. And actually, I've got to be honest, I probably wouldn't have picked this up without other people's recommendations. So if you have been waiting for a recommendation and this doesn't typically seem like your bag, it is incredible. Really, really enjoyable. But for now, good night. Good morning. I wanted to do kind of back-to-back check-ins because when I woke up this morning, I jumped right back in, and finally something good happened for Viz, and I was so happy. And actually, the chapter that I read right after page 500 made me cry. I just am so glad that something good finally happened for Viz. I feel like couldn't have happened to a better guy. But also, I felt like this chapter gave us some really much needed catharsis. His backstory has always been tragic, but it's been a little bit disconnected, and we've gotten like crumbs here and there. And this kind of pulled some things full circle. And I also thought the conversation that happened in this chapter touched on more explicitly on some of the themes I think the book is trying to explore. It touched on these collective action problems where, you know, there's a major disaster happening, but the people who are in power do not feel incentivized enough to protect others to give up some of their own power, which is a little bit familiar in the modern world. There is one of these storylines that I have found to be like much grimmer and more serious than the others, and almost explicitly they've said that this one storyline is like where the decisions are going to be made or broken, and the other worlds or storylines that we're following are just kind of fleshing out a little bit more, like establishing higher stakes for their own sake. But the major stakes are being decided in this one storyline, and that is where I'm at right now. I've seen some critique of this series and this book in particular. First of all, that the three-part story creates kind of this repetitive rhythm. I have not found that to be the case. I feel like what's happening in each world is unique enough to be interesting and compelling. And I also feel like it's interesting to see our primary character, Viz, sort of change based on different circumstances in different worlds. In one world in particular, the grimmest version of this story, I feel that he has become a lot more practical and sacrificed some of his ideals a bit more, which has been interesting to see him get his hands a little bit dirtier. Because if there's one critique that I have found a bit valid, it's that our guy is a little bit too good. Unfortunately, there's almost no world in which you get to make every right decision. And so some of the decisions that he has had to make have had negative consequences or immoral consequences that he's had to contend with. So I really like that. I wish it was a little bit more. I wish we could see him developing in very different directions based on the circumstances that he's in each of these storylines. But I have about 200 pages left. It might be optimistic to say that I'll finish this today, but if not today, then probably tomorrow. I've already done a little taste testing, and they are delicious. Hopefully I've been able to cut out, but I will be honest and transparent and say that there were a number of mishaps in the baking. First of all, I had my yogurt in an enamel bowl and I was hitting the spoon to try to get some yogurt off the spoon. And all these little flecks were suddenly appearing in my yogurt, and it took me way too long to realize that I was like chipping off the side of the bowl. So we got all those out, hopefully. If anybody breaks a tooth on a muffin, that one's on me. And then when I opened our spice cabinet, which I hope that every spice cabinet in America is as overstuffed as ours. Every house I've ever lived in or been to has had an overstuffed spice cabinet. But something dropped out and like shattered a spoon rest. So, you know, it took me a little bit of trial and error to get to this point. So I'm glad that we finally got here. Good morning. So yesterday was a pretty busy day, and I only got maybe 50, 70 more pages into Strength of the Few, but we are going to be finishing this book today. It is December 31st, so it's my last chance to finish this book in 2025, and I have 100 pages about left. I'm almost reluctant to finish this because I know the last 100 pages of the first book were so explosive and kind of emotionally gutting. I will say the pages that I read yesterday lost me a little bit. You know, it's hard to stay consistently strong through 700 pages, but if you're going to set that, you know, length for yourself, you need to be able to do it. And there was one section to the grimmest storyline that just didn't seem to make any sense. Sometimes he's kind of picking up in each of the storylines after a time jump, and we're just supposed to, like, he'll explain eventually what happened during the interval, or he'll like get around to explaining why we're doing what we're doing now as opposed to where we left off. So it's still explained, it still makes sense eventually, but when you have this triplicate story and there's like different fantasy worlds and different stakes and different characters in each of the triplicate worlds, it would be great if, as a simplification measure, we were able to at least explain where we're jumping into in the new storyline every time we change storylines quickly and efficiently. And there was one section of the storyline in one of them that like still didn't make any sense and like maybe explained in the next installment, but left me a little bit less satisfied than I had been in all of the previous installments. So last 100 pages, come on, James Islington, don't let me down, stay strong. I will check back in when I have finished. Happy 2026. I have finished The Strength of the Few. I actually finished this on the 31st, and I gave myself a couple of days to kind of think about my review and really solidify my final impression. And I've decided at the end of the day to give this a 4-star. I know it looks a little different. I put the dust jacket back on. I never read a big old book with its dust jacket on, but I do kind of like this cover. I know it was a little controversial, but when I read the book, I think the cover is kind of cool art and makes sense. So I'll start with what I really loved about it, because I think that this really earned its 4 stars. First of all, our protagonist, Viz, remained interesting, fascinating. I loved that because of the triplicate storyline, he developed slightly differently in different worlds, but I think he's a pretty strong and clearly articulated character, so he stayed identifiable across the entire story. I think James Islington does a great job kind of researching and fleshing out different worlds, and he set himself the challenge of doing that in triplicate in this book, and he did accomplish it. I felt like each world had its own very comprehensive atmosphere and characters, which were well developed, and, you know, its own subset of the magic system. I thought all of that was done really well. I loved that this book kind of explored this idea of assimilation within rebellion. Viz is not at school anymore, and the consequences for his actions continue to go up. The responsibility that he bears continues to go up, and so he is not able to keep his hands as clean as they have been. He maintains the same goal, or at least in his mind, he maintains the same goal and the same values, but we see that his actions are getting a little bit murkier. And I think that that's really interesting. The moral gray area is where a lot of interest lies in fiction for me. The reason I docked a star was that I think it's really ambitious to write a 3-part story, and I think there were some natural weaknesses to that technique that did end up showing up. The first is that not all 3 stories I thought were like equally interesting and fulfilling to the last. There was one storyline, which I've mentioned before, that was consistently a lot grimmer. It had much higher stakes, but it had less engaging and fun aspects going for it than the other 2. Kind of as an inverse, the other 2 had lower stakes, and so they had a lot more of the characters that we care about, but they suffered a bit for that lack of consequences. My other critique is that James Islington set up characters in the first book so well that we ended up loving, and I felt like we were a little bit robbed of our time with them in this book. There was and I felt like the impact of that was very much mitigated by the amount of time that we had spent away from that particular world and storyline. So that was a little bit disappointing. The ending of this book was fascinating. It took me some time to provide this review, in part because of its ending. Depending on how James Islington takes it, it is either a really explosive, interesting, morally gray, complex, and grim choice, or a complete cop-out. And we will see what I end up thinking however many years from now when the 3rd comes out. But either way, I really, in order to read 700 pages of a book, you have to be enjoying it a decent amount. And I really enjoyed this book. And I'm interested to see how all of its themes bear out and what James Islington decides to carry through for the third book. I would also love to see a third book that brings these storylines back together a bit more. I think we're going to have to kind of reconverge at some point in the third book for me to consider this a complete success. But either way, James Islington took some interesting risks that I appreciated, and I really enjoyed this book. This was a great way to close out my 2025. Let me know what you thought, and I will be back with another video soon. Bye.